The thing about living in a quiet neighborhood is that when your neighbor four doors down has a yappy asshole of a dog that they leave out on their balcony to bark at every single thing that moves past them. Well, what I'm getting at is I killed a dog earlier. Two, three, four, do 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 do. Dee dee da 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 da. Like I remember I want to say about 15 years ago, I realized that Garth Ennis, my favorite comic book writer, hated dogs. Largely, not largely, small yappy dogs, which I remember at the time being like, oh no, that's terrible because obviously my aunt growing up had two, and other women in my life have had little yappy dogs. My roommate has two of them, and it's similar to when I saw the film Heathers. When I first saw the film Heathers, I was 12 years old. If you're not familiar, a lot of teenagers die in the film Heathers, and I was aghast. And then fast forward 3 years later, when I was a teenager, I was like, why aren't they killing more of these motherfuckers? And that's how I feel about little yappy dogs now. It's not the dogs either. I wish no harm upon the dogs. It is shoddy dog ownership. And if my roommate watched this at all, I might want to get defensive here, but she doesn't. Okay. First up this week, we have Axc Avengers Number One. Now, this is not much to add to what I've been saying about the Axc Judgment Day event that's been going on in the Marvel Universe. For right now, issue 5 was last week, and things are continue to escalate, which is, it does kind of remind me of Empire, which was the big Marvel crossover of 2020, which was obviously interrupted just as it was beginning, if I'm not mistaken. But that was a book that started out. The event was, oh, the Kree and Skrull are going to invade Earth again, and then it turned out to be the Kotati, and the Kree and Skrull are actually allied. It was a big twist, and I feel like if this is a trend, then I'm all for it because it means that they're going to start to try to upset what the event actually is, and that's good for people like me who have read dozens of these at this point. So I think what they're doing before the series itself continues on, in order to squeeze more money out of this event, which is what they're all about, really, these hero gasms. They're going to do an Avengers one, they're going to do an X-Men one, they're going to do an Eternals one. They're going to be one shots each. And I think they're all written by Kieran Gillen, who's been not oddly enough, the bulk of the writing. Usually with these events, certainly since Bendis's time, there will be one core writer, and then they'll bring in others. But the events, like I just reread House of M from 2006, 2005, and that was the first big event that they had done since Infinity War, where it crossed over into a bunch of other titles. Axc crosses over into several other titles. They're not, I think they're probably wisely like not trying to loop people into buying a shitload more books than they would. I think all the books that this event is crossing over into are ones that I buy anyway. But even like going back to House of M or Civil War or any of those early ones when they were really fun again, they hadn't been around for 10 years. Even those I didn't buy all of them because there's just too many. But this feels like an event that's just a little more scaled down and is all the better for it. So big surprise to me this year. I was not expecting to particularly be so into the event, but there you have it. Also this week, to begin spooky season, we have DC Horror presents Sergeant Rock versus the Army of the Dead. DC Horror is an imprint that they started with the guy, or not with them, but I believe the first book, I could be mistaken, but one of the first anyway was Soul Plumber, which was done by the guys who do the last podcast on the left, or the last podcast on the left, which I have never listened to, but I am a big fan of Henry Zabrowski's acting work. I believe there was also a Joe Hill thing. The Bucket Full of Heads, I think, was DC Horror with its sequel, A Refrigerator Full of Heads. I mean, DC Horror is about as uninspired a name for an as you can come up with. They might as well call everything else DC superheroes. But this is great. This is nothing but fun. Sergeant Rock is, of course, DC's Nick Fury, or World War II era Nick Fury. Anyway, I don't know what they did with Rock. You know, I'm not as into DC as I've mentioned, and like with Nick Fury, you know, Sergeant Fury and the Howling Commandos was his first book, and it was just a straight ahead World War II book, and then they decided to bring Nick into the present of the 1960s with Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., where it was a super spy book. Rock didn't get that. I think Rock was always just a sergeant, and he never became anything else. I'm probably completely wrong. And I mean, I can't even imagine now that they didn't try to do that with him in the 70s or 80s. But he's basically just stayed a mainstay of DC's war books. This is written by Bruce Campbell, star of the Evil Dead trilogy, and so I'm assuming. I don't think it's going to be directly tied to Evil Dead, but since obviously Bruce Campbell has some experience with these characters, etc., it's going to be good. It's also drawn by Eduardo Risso, who does not draw nearly enough and is one of my favorite artists. Eduardo Risso is Brazilian, I want to say. He's from South America, I know that much. And his biggest thing was 100 Bullets with Brian Azzarello, which remains one of my favorite comics. But really, I'll buy anything Risso draws. They Azzarello and Risso have worked together several times. They did a Batman art called Forgotten City, I think it was called, or Lost City, something like that. And it's fine. And then they did a book which just ended not too long ago called Moonshine, which was a werewolf book set in the amongst the Prohibition era booze smugglers. And it wasn't bad, but honestly, the only thing that really kept me coming back was Risso's artwork. Every month the book would come out, and I'd kind of go, I'm going to get this one, I guess. I was super excited. But then I could take it home and read it, and there was at least once, if not more, like one page at least per book where I was just like, Jesus, how does this guy do it? He's super duper good. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. This is a 6-issue series. I always feel like horror in Halloween time is hack, but it doesn't mean I'm going to turn it down either. And then finally, from the good people at Aftershock, we have this oversized one shot. Hell is a Squared Circle, written by Chris Condon, who is the writer for That Texas Blood, which is a book from Image that I enjoy. It's drawn by Francesco Biagini, or Biagini, I'm not sure how to pronounce his name, but Italy has been an extremely reliable source for good comic book artists for a while now. I don't know if it's to the point of where, like, in the 70s, there was a huge wave of Filipino artists. And I don't know if it's as concentrated as all that. Because back then, it was largely an economic factor that these artists would work for a lot less money than Americans, which is really shitty. But it also got them work and made them, big, which is also good. And the Philippines still has there's a lot of guys that still come out of the Philippines. And Italy is no stranger to comic books, but a lot of my favorite artists these days are Italian. And now I'm hard pressed to think of any names. I've had a long. It wasn't that bad. It's just not. It's long. That's all. But yeah. Anyway. So obviously it's a wrestling comic. It's on the back it says, "Is wrestling noir a genre? It is now." And I picked this for the shop. This was my shop for the week also. And in the little write up I did on the email, just because that was also in the solicit on the Diamond page. Diamond says wrestling noir genre, and I very sarcastically wrote, "As always, Diamond is wrong. Of course, it's a genre. It has been for some time." I apologize to the Jeppy family. of course, wrestling noir is a genre. In 2009, Charles Soule, one of his first thing, maybe even, he did a book called Strongman, which was about a lucha libre private eye. Um, I mean, the Mickey Rourke film, The Wrestler, is pretty noir when you get right down to it. There was a book on Image written by Joe Keating called Ringside, which was very. I mean, noir is a word that gets batted around a lot, but I would say Ringside definitely has a lot of elements of crime and sex and violence, obviously. So, I mean, I would count that. And then there was also there in 2013, I want to say around that time, there were two different comic biographies of Andre the Giant, and boy, that guy lived a darker life than I had realized. Maybe not as much as Jake the Snake Roberts, but still pretty dark. One thing that I learned that I had no idea was the guy was he had a real alcohol problem, but he would have to drink a party ball just to feel it. You know, he was just a huge guy. Anyway, so I don't know anything beyond that. I mean, the title alone, even if I weren't into wrestling at all, would be enough for me to pick it up. Um, and I don't know that I've ever really gone on a wrestling rant on here. Not that I'm going to do so now, but I love wrestling. I haven't followed wrestling in 25 years, but I've always been a big, big fan of professional wrestling. And I think it was about, yeah, from the ages of like 9 to 19. That was my big wrestling time, especially like junior high. And it's very similar. Professional wrestling is hugely similar to superhero comics. Big, bright, colorful characters, very simplified good and evil stories, a lot of violence, a lot of, emphasis placed on physical strength and stuff like that. It's all very superhero-y. When I lost interest in wrestling, it probably had something to do with the fact that I was just kind of growing out of it. I hate that phrase. I hate when people say they grow out of things, unless they're, genes or something. I don't know. It's such a dumb way to look at it. But I will allow as that there have been several things in my life that I've been super duper into and then lost that real passion for. And the fervor of youth, I guess it is. But I think wrestling also just kind of sucks, or started to suck anyway. In the late 90s, it became much more about, it became more similar to like reality TV, which was a bigger deal. I think I have gone on this little rant before, so I'm going to cut this short. But I love wrestling. I think the it's another thing too, where like when I was a kid, wrestling was a pretty niche thing, at least where I grew up. Me and my nerd friends like loved it, but it wasn't that mainstream. It was, you still had to kind of look for it, even with WWF, which was the biggest thing at the time. And people knew who Hulk Hogan was, even back then, but it wasn't like it is now, where all the guys who grew up watching wrestling in the 80s and 90s, as I did, and who stayed in it, not unlike how I've done with comics, and have watched it evolve as a sport or as a form of entertainment. I have a lot in comedy and stand up. There are tons of dudes. I don't know why exactly beyond what I'm just saying here, but yeah, there's this whole generation of comedians that I knew who were like in their late 20s, early 30s, so about 10 years younger than me, who it was really important to them. I'm impressed by your dedication to this. But I mean, they were young. I was 20 or so in the late 90s when it really started to stink, or in my opinion anyway. And these guys were just starting. So to them, it's the bedrock. But um, so I feel like there has been, and just in pop culture in general, trend towards professional wrestling in a way it's never been taken as seriously as it is now. It's never been so beloved. I don't think it's hugely popular. I think it's still kind of a niche thing, but it's not nearly as much as when I was a kid. When I was a kid, there was WWF, and that was it. If you went to your grandparents' house, they might have a cable channel that would get the NWA, which was what WCW was called originally. But it was pretty much always WWF for me. But now I don't even think WWF is the main wrestling federation. I think it is. But yeah, so there's definitely starting to be more and more wrestling comics, and I think it's great. Do a power bomb. That's the other one I was trying to think of. which is currently going on. And it's great, and especially for comics, because it doesn't have to be superhero comics, but it definitely, the medium loans itself to these kind of big, colorful characters and these, stories of good and evil and stuff like that. So it's a perfect match. I'm frankly surprised there haven't been more wrestling comics. So if somebody asks you if wrestling noir is a genre, you tell them, dude, I don't give a shit. I have a life. I got a mortgage to take care of. I'm assuming you all have mortgages. Okay, what I read last week. First up, Frank Miller presents Ashcan #1. I don't. I think maybe I'll just, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna trail off on this one. So, the first thing that he's doing, I mentioned this last week, is a sequel to Ronin, which was his first. I always thought it came after Dark Knight Returns, but it came after Daredevil, before Dark Knight Returns. And so the story in here, it kind of, it flashes back on some stuff from the original, but not enough to really jog my memory. And I didn't expect it to. I haven't read Ronin in probably 10 years, maybe 15. Frank's plotting it, but he's not drawing it, which is a bit of a problem. Philip Tan is drawing it. Philip Tan is a very good artist. Not my kind of thing. Philip Tan, and then this is largely what I'm just going to piece together. Philip Tan is one of Mark's or Jim Valentino's, kind of prodigies. Philip Tan drew that last Shadowhawk book that came out not too long ago, and he has a very, very early Image style, which is cute, but I don't want to see. I like reading that stuff as a goof, and I don't really like that it's still going. The plotting, I don't know if this has ever come up, but plotting, as it might imply, is basically doing rough outlines of where everything's going to go. It doesn't have much to do with the story directly, as the name might imply, but it's basically composing the panels, and depending on the artist, the plotter will do like rough pencils and stuff, and then the artist will come in and do it. And these are all very recognizable to me anyway, as Frank Miller. I mean, he drew a lady on all fours. That's very Frank Miller. And this pose is also very the holding their breasts thing. And Philip Tan's work isn't bad, like I say. It's just, generally speaking, not my thing. Like, I would have much rather seen Miller draw this stuff. Or even Klaus Janson, somebody similar to Frank in style. So it is interesting seeing a pretty different artist basically draw a Frank Miller story. But I'd rather see Frank Miller draw a Frank Miller story myself. The other story in this is Ancient Enemies, which is written by Dan Didio and drawn by Danilo Beyruth. Danilo? I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. My apologies. And the art is really good, I will say that. But honestly, it took me 3 tries to get through this story. It's extremely boring. And it's this thing, too, and you see it in science fiction all the time. It's one of the things, because I was a big fiction guy my whole life, science fiction in particular, and as a kid. And then I got super into crime fiction, and then that was my main thing all through like my 20s into my 30s. And then it was comics and nonfiction was what I was reading most of the time. And now I'm kind of back on the science fiction kick, like more so than I have been since like high school. But there's this thing in science fiction, and I'm trying to think of like other examples, but where there's a whole, in this story, the ancient enemies in question are basically the Kree and the Skrulls. There's 2 alien races who have been warring with each other for thousands, if not millions of years, to the point where none of them even remember why, but they still have to do it. It's just become part of their culture. And now Earth is going to become the battleground. That is pretty much the plot outline of the Kree-Skrull War from the early 70s. But there's this thing too in science fiction. World building is a big deal in science fiction, which I think it shares with comic books. But it seems to me a lot of time authors want to build the whole world in the prologue. in the preface or something, and it's like, honey, you can't. So this whole story is just it's just exposition, 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 and it's not at least it's being told through story. It's not just a narrator telling you everything that's happening, but it might as well be. So I will probably not be buying Ancient Enemies when it comes out. And then the tease here, like I know what I just said about wanting to see Miller draw it, but if Milo Manara is going to be drawing Sin City, I am all for that. Milo Manara is largely known for his work in erotica, which is a fancy comic book word for stroke book. Milo Manara, another Italian. In the 80s, I want to say, is when he really blew up into the 90s. And his whole body of work was being published by the Eros imprint of Fantagraphics books. And so I never got an appreciation of his work because I was underage. But he's an incredible artist. I mean, masturbatory use aside, his books are really good. And if he's drawn Sin City, I mean, there's a lot of Foxy Broads in Sin City, so it makes sense. There's also Sin City 1892 is teased at the end of this too, but it doesn't give any indication as who's going to be writing it and drawing it. I believe the drawing here is by Miller. Yeah, that's definitely Manara, and that's definitely Frank Miller. Sin City 1858, my mistake. I said 82. Pre-Civil War, Sin City. That I'm still excited, even if Miller doesn't draw it or write it. I think just I don't know why the hell they haven't thought of doing a Cowboy Sin City, or maybe he has thought of it. Why he's waited until now, I don't. Also, this week I read Vanish Number One. This was pretty good. I have to remind myself what happens in it now, though. I was looking at these books. I'm like, do I need to? Oh, okay, yeah, that's right. Vanish is actually somewhat similar story to Ancient Enemies, but not nearly as transparent a ripoff of a Marvel story, nor... Okay. If I remember this correctly, the basic premise is that there's this other dimension, this other realm, magic and stuff like that. And our hero has made his way to Earth, but he's kind of just become a bum. And on this Earth, when superheroes arrive, and there are people like, oh, wow, it's really magic. They're really from this other dimension. They're not superheroes. That's a terrible sum up of it, but I do like this book. This happens a lot with these image books, especially it seems these days. Is the first issue will come out and I like it, but I don't remember anything, and it's kind of become a thing where it feels like they're waiting until I have to wait till issue 2 to really make up my mind. And if I read issue 2 and it doesn't grab me, then I'll bail on it. But I don't want to damn it with faint praise either, because I could read issue 2 and just go, oh man, this is so good. And then also, Creepshow number 1, this is good. There's nothing really to say about it. It's very much in the vein of the EC comics, Tales from the Crypt, etc. The first story is written and drawn by Chris Burnham, who is a great artist. He drew The Filth with Grant Morrison, right? I believe. And a bunch of other stuff. He's always been a great artist. I don't know that he's written much stuff, but this story is really good. They're also pretty easy. These kinds of horror stories are very, like, just morality plays. And then Paul Dini and Stephen Langford write the second story, and John McCrae draws it. It was weird, though, because, I mean, John McCrae's art has been evolving over the last few things I've seen him do. I've been kind of like, well, that's McCrae, huh? Because this is a pretty fun story too. Take this panel though, for example. 15 years ago, both of these young girls' faces would have been a little more abstract. Like, McCrae was never one to, like, his work has become more real, has more realism in it than it used to. And I'm not mad at it. It just always throws me off. I go, this is McCrae. And then I look and I go, oh yeah, I can see it now. But it's one of those things you kind of have to look. These reading glasses aren't helping, but then this is too much. I think we're done. Oh, jeez. I really thought this was going to be... That felt like only 5 minutes, right?